Go beg somewhere else. You don't belong in front of this building." He gave his last $20 to a stranger outside a glass tower. Security cameras caught it. Executives walked past him like he didn't exist. The maintenance worker didn't hesitate. He handed it over anyway. By sunrise, his name was on the company door. Because dignity sees what power overlooks. Before I show you the exact moment when the CEO stepped out of the elevator and froze at that name. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. This isn't just about money changing hands. It's about a man everyone underestimated, and the quiet storm building behind his silence. Rain slid down the mirrored face of Virali Dynamics, like the building itself was trying to wash him away. Caleb Ardent stood near the service entrance in his faded maintenance jacket, lunch pail tucked under one arm, watching the stranger who had just been shoved aside by security. The stranger's coat was expensive once, not now. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from something deeper. Panic, calculation, shame. "You don't have to explain," Caleb said quietly. The man looked up, startled. "I'm not asking for charity." "Didn't say you were." He reached into his wallet. One bill. $20. The money meant for Lena's inhaler refill after work. For a fraction of a second, hesitation pressed against his ribs. He could almost hear his daughter's soft wheeze at night, the way she tried to pretend it didn't scare her. Then he held the bill out. The stranger stared at it. Why? Because sometimes you just need a little breathing room. The words carried more weight than the rain. Across the marble plaza, heels clicked. Marjorie Klein, Chief Operations Officer, paused beneath the awning of the executive entrance. Her tailored coat, sharp as a blade, didn't belong in the same frame as oil-stained boots. She watched the exchange with open disdain. "Unbelievable," she muttered to the security chief. "They'll give anyone access to this property." "He's maintenance," the guard replied. "That explains it." Caleb didn't react. He had learned long ago that pride wasted energy better spent elsewhere. He simply nodded once to the stranger and turned toward the employee entrance. Behind him, the man's voice carried faintly through the rain. "You don't even know who I am." Caleb didn't turn back. "Doesn't matter." Inside, fluorescent lights hummed. The scent of industrial cleaner mixed with ozone from the server floors below. He clocked in without ceremony, shoulders steady, mind already cataloging the building's rhythms. Power fluctuations had been subtle all week, barely noticeable unless you understood how systems spoke. A flicker in corridor lighting. A 2-second lag in the freight elevator. Cooling fans spinning harder than necessary. He signed the maintenance log, noting timestamps others ignored. "Morning," Ethan Rowe said from behind a rolling cart stacked with diagnostic tablets. The junior systems analyst looked exhausted. "Morning," Caleb replied. "You notice the grid spike at 2 a.m.? "Yeah." Ethan blinked. You track that stuff?" Caleb shrugged. "Building talks if you listen." Upstairs, laughter echoed from the executive corridor. Investors were touring the facility today. Champagne before noon. Success polished to a mirror shine. Down here, a different world moved, wrenches, cables, ductwork vibrating faintly under unseen strain. He crouched beside a service panel, pressing his palm against the metal. Warm. Too warm. A memory flashed, not of this building, but of desert heat radiating off armored vehicles, of radio chatter spiking before systems failed under pressure. Logistics wasn't just numbers. It was survival. Predict the failure before it swallowed you. He tightened a coupling, then stood. Through a narrow window, he could see the stranger still outside, speaking quietly with security now. The man's posture had changed, less desperate, more composed, curious, but curiosity didn't refill prescriptions. He checked his watch. If he picked up an extra shift tonight, maybe the pharmacy would wait another day. His phone buzzed. A message from Lena. Dad, did you remember about the inhaler? Nurse says I'm wheezing again. His jaw tightened, but his reply came steady. I've got it handled, kiddo. Always do. He slid the phone back into his pocket and looked down the corridor stretching toward the executive elevators, the ones maintenance wasn't supposed to use. Somewhere above, power symbols gleamed, corner offices, biometric locks, the polished name of Silas Virelli etched into glass. Somewhere below, something in the grid wasn't right. Caleb adjusted his gloves and walked toward the control room, unaware that the stranger he'd helped was already being escorted inside through a private entrance, and that by morning, the name on the door upstairs wouldn't be the only one people remembered. The control room lights flickered once, brief, almost shy, before steadying again. He noticed. Most wouldn't have. Caleb stepped inside the sub-level operations hub, where wall-sized monitors displayed live diagnostics of Virelli Dynamics' automated infrastructure. Conveyor routing for shipping prototypes. Server load distribution. Climate regulation for sensitive hardware. The kind of system built to impress investors and collapse spectacularly if mismanaged. Ethan was already there, fingers flying across a tablet. There, see that? He said, pointing at a graph spiking in uneven intervals. It's probably just a calibration delay. Probably, Caleb echoed, but his gaze stayed fixed on the deeper metric beneath it, the cascading micro surges feeding into the main grid. Log it, he said quietly. Ethan hesitated. Operations doesn't like noise during investor days. Log it anyway. Footsteps echoed behind them. Marjorie Klein entered like a blade sliding from silk. 2 board members trailed her, followed by a small cluster of investors in tailored suits. This, she announced, gesturing vaguely toward the glowing screens, is the backbone of our predictive logistics model. Self-correcting. Autonomous. One investor frowned at the flicker on a side monitor. That spike normal? Completely, she replied without looking. Caleb cleared his throat. It's not. Silence fell like a dropped plate. Marjorie turned slowly. Excuse me? The subgrid's overcompensating, he said evenly. Cooling systems are pulling extra load. If it keeps climbing, it'll cascade. A board member chuckled. And you are? Maintenance. That was enough to tilt the room. Marjorie's smile thinned. Our engineering team has the situation fully assessed. With respect, Caleb said, voice calm but firm, they're looking at surface data. The pattern underneath. I think, she interrupted smoothly, you should return to your assigned responsibilities. Heat rose behind Ethan's ears. He's right about the pattern. Mr. Rowe, she cut in, eyes sharp, focus. Investors exchanged glances. One whispered, is this rehearsed? It's handled, she assured them. Caleb didn't argue further. He simply stepped back, but his eyes never left the monitors. A tremor passed through the floor, barely perceptible. He felt it in his boots. That wasn't normal. He leaned closer to Ethan. Check the coolant pressure on server cluster B. Ethan swallowed and tapped commands. Across the room, Marjorie began describing projected quarterly returns. The numbers on Ethan's screen shifted. Pressures fluctuating, how much? 7%, now 10. Caleb exhaled slowly. There it was. He turned back toward Marjorie. You need to throttle the load before the coolant fails. Her expression hardened. Security? A guard stepped forward. This isn't a discussion, she said. You're overstepping. The guard's hand brushed Caleb's shoulder. Not rough, but clear. Humiliation wasn't loud. It was precise. Understood, he said quietly. As he walked toward the door, he caught Ethan's anxious stare. Keep watching Cluster B, he murmured. The corridor outside buzzed with investor chatter. Glass walls reflected tailored suits and polished confidence. Through them, he could see the company logo gleaming above the atrium. Power never looked down here. His phone vibrated again. Another message from Lena. Dad? Nurse says if it gets worse, I might have to sit out gym again. His jaw tightened. I know, kiddo, he whispered under his breath. Just a little longer. A sharp alarm pierced the hallway. Not loud yet. Just a warning tone. Heads turned. Inside the control room, voices rose. Caleb didn't run. He walked back in. Ethan's face had gone pale. Cluster B just hit critical variance. On the central monitor, red lines bloomed like fractures spreading across glass. Investors stepped back instinctively. Marjorie's composure flickered for the first time. Why is that red? Because the coolant's failing, Caleb said. You said it was contained. No, Ethan whispered. You said that. The floor vibrated again, stronger. From somewhere below, a mechanical groan echoed through the steel framework. One investor cursed. Another demanded reassurance. Marjorie snapped, Call engineering. They're in transit, traffic from the airport. How long? 40 minutes. They didn't have 40 minutes. Caleb stepped toward the main console. The guard moved to block him. Let him, Ethan blurted. Marjorie hesitated, just long enough for another alarm to split the air. Louder now, urgent. If this system overheated, the data center would ignite. Millions in losses. Possibly worse. She swallowed. Fine. You have 2 minutes. He nodded once and slid into the operator's seat. His fingers moved with practiced precision, not guessing, not experimenting. Behind him, investors watched the maintenance worker touch systems they barely understood. Because sometimes the one dismissed sees the fracture first. If you're still here, subscribe with the bell on, because what's about to happen in this room will change everything. The monitors pulsed red. And Caleb began to work. The alarms weren't screaming yet, but they were getting there, rising in pitch like something pulling air into burning lungs. The red indicators spread across the central grid map, each one marking a node pulling more power than it could safely carry. He didn't rush. Rushing caused mistakes. Cluster B is overheating because it's compensating for a pressure drop in C, he said, eyes locked on the data stream. But C's pulling load from A, and A's already near limit. Ethan hovered over his shoulder. So we just redistribute. No, if you redistribute blindly, you collapse the whole spine. Marjorie folded her arms, though her knuckles had gone pale. You have 90 seconds, he ignored the clock. Instead, he closed his eyes for half a heartbeat. Desert wind. Radio static. A convoy stalled under heat and hostile fire because someone overloaded the supply chain without understanding terrain strain. Systems failed when ego replaced assessment. He opened his eyes. Manual override on coolant valves, he ordered. That's restricted, Ethan whispered. Do it. Ethan's fingers trembled but obeyed. On the screen, a warning flashed, executive authorization required. Marjorie stepped forward. You do not have clearance. Then give it, he said calmly. A vibration shuddered through the floor, hard enough this time that a glass of water on the investor table tipped over. Silence swallowed the room. Marjorie hesitated, calculating optics against catastrophe. Authorization code, she snapped. Ethan entered it. The lock symbol disappeared. Good, Caleb murmured. Now isolate B from the main loop. That'll spike A. Only for 6 seconds. You can't guarantee that. I can. He rerouted the sequence, fingers moving faster now, but still controlled. The central display split into layered grids, revealing the underlying architecture few outside the original design team had ever studied. Investors exchanged uneasy glances. Who trained him? One whispered. Another monitor flashed crimson. Temperature climbing. He felt sweat gather under his collar, but his breathing stayed even. "Throttle intake at valve 14, he said. "That's counterintuitive," Ethan muttered. "So was surviving my last deployment." Ethan blinked, but adjusted the valve. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the red line on cluster B dipped, slightly. "Again," he said. Marjorie leaned closer despite herself. "Explain what you're doing." Buying time. Another tremor rolled through the building, followed by a low mechanical groan from below the data center floor. Somewhere upstairs, the investor tour had dissolved into confusion. Through the glass wall, he could see assistants herding guests away from windows. The company logo in the atrium flickered. "Pressure stabilizing at 8% over baseline," Ethan said, disbelief creeping into his voice. "Hold it there." The alarm volume lowered by 1 notch. Not gone, but no longer climbing. Marjorie exhaled slowly. "Engineering will handle the rest when they arrive." He shook his head. "This isn't random failure. What does that mean?" "It means your predictive model is overcorrecting. It learned to prioritize speed over resilience. That works until it doesn't." She stared at him. "That system was vetted by top consultants. Consultants don't crawl inside ductwork at 3 a.m. The room went still. On the far monitor, a new warning blinked, cluster D now trending upward. Ethan swore softly. "It's spreading," he nodded. "Because the algorithm thinks this is a localized event. It's not." "So what is it?" Marjorie demanded. A chain reaction, he stood. "Where are you going?" she asked sharply. "Below." "You'll destabilize it further, no?" He said quietly. "I'll stabilize it where it starts." Without waiting for permission, he moved toward the service stairwell. The guard hesitated, then stepped aside. Metal stairs rang under his boots as he descended into the industrial belly of the tower. The hum of servers grew louder, thicker, like the air itself carried electricity. Behind him, Ethan followed, breath uneven. "You've done this before," Ethan said. "Yes." "In another company?" "In another life." They reached the sub-level corridor leading to the cooling distribution chamber. Heat rolled toward them in waves. He pressed his palm against the metal door. "Hotter now. Manual bypass will give us 3 minutes," he said. "After that, we either solve it or it burns." Ethan swallowed. "Burns like you don't want to imagine." Above them, the building held its breath. Inside the control room, Marjorie watched the live feed from a security camera aimed at the sub-level corridor. The maintenance worker who'd been escorted out minutes earlier was now the only thing standing between her and a financial disaster. She hated that. But she couldn't look away. Below, he opened the door to the cooling chamber. Steam hissed. Red light bathed the room like a warning flare. And for the first time since the alarms began, a flicker of something else moved through him, not fear. Focus sharpened into something almost cold. This was no longer about humiliation. It was about survival. Steam rolled across the cooling chamber floor, thick enough to blur the far wall. The metallic scent of overheated circuitry mixed with the sharp bite of industrial coolant. Pipes rattled overhead like bones under strain. He stepped inside. "The door stays open," he told Ethan. "If it seals, we're cooked." Ethan nodded quickly, propping it with a maintenance wedge. On the far side of the chamber, the primary coolant manifold vibrated violently. The automated control arm attached to valve 14 jerked in tight, frantic movements, trying to compensate for conflicting system commands. "There," Caleb said. "That actuator's overcorrecting." Ethan squinted through the steam. "But the software shows it's stabilizing. Software's lying." He moved closer, boots slipping slightly on condensation. Heat pressed against his face, prickling his skin. The pressure gauge above the manifold ticked upward, 12% over baseline now. If that seals under this load, pressure spikes back into B and D simultaneously, he said. That's your chain reaction. Ethan's voice wavered. Engineering's still 30 minutes out. We don't have 30. He reached for the manual override lever beside the manifold. It resisted, locked by the same executive permissions governing the digital system. Upstairs, in the control room, Marjorie watched through the live feed, jaw tight. He cannot tamper with that without authorization, she muttered. A board member shot back, if he doesn't, we lose the floor. She hesitated again. Below, he looked at Ethan. Call up and tell them to unlock mechanical overrides. They're not going to. Tell them the alternative is a data center fire. Ethan grabbed his radio, voice cracking slightly as he relayed the message. Silence stretched. Then, over the radio, Marjorie's clipped voice, authorization granted for mechanical override. You have 5 minutes. He didn't waste one. With a sharp pull, he disengaged the actuator arm from valve 14. The machine shrieked in protest, sparks snapping as it lost automated control. Steam thickened. Pressure? He called. Ethan checked his tablet. 14%, still climbing. Good. Ethan stared at him. Good? It means the system's still trying to overcompensate. Once it realizes we've cut the feedback loop, it'll drop. He crouched beside the manifold, gripping the manual wheel. It burned against his gloves. On 3, he muttered. You throttle intake from C by 5%, that'll spike D. For 2 seconds, and if you're wrong? He didn't answer. 1, 2, 3, he turned the wheel. Metal screamed. Ethan adjusted the intake. For a breathless moment, the gauge shot to 16%. Above them, lights flickered across the building. In the atrium, investors gasped as the company logo dimmed again. Pressure's peaking. Ethan shouted, "Hold it." The gauge trembled. 17. Then it stopped. The needle quivered and began to fall. 15. 13. 11. Ethan let out a shaky laugh. It's dropping. It's actually dropping. The steam thinned slightly as coolant flow normalized. He didn't smile. Check cluster D. Ethan swiped through screens. Stabilizing. 8% over baseline, now 6. Good. Lock manual at current position. You're overriding the predictive model entirely. For now. Above them, the alarms shifted tone, no longer urgent but cautionary. Upstairs, Marjorie's shoulders lowered an inch. Around her, board members whispered in disbelief. He just bypassed a proprietary AI system, one said. With a wrench, another added quietly. In the chamber, he tightened the manual lock and stepped back, chest rising steadily. Sweat soaked through his collar, but his hands remained sure. Ethan stared at him like he was seeing someone new. How did you know? He wiped condensation from his gloves. Systems don't fail alone. They fail in patterns. That's not something you learn in maintenance. No, he agreed softly. A faint crackle echoed overhead, residual strain releasing from the pipes. He glanced up. We're not done, he said. Ethan's relief faltered. What else? The algorithm that caused this is still running. If we leave it, it'll repeat. Upstairs, Marjorie's voice crackled through the radio again. Status? Contained, Ethan replied, breathless. Manual override engaged. There was a pause. Then, reluctantly, return to control room. He exchanged a look with Ethan. Go, he said. Tell them to suspend automated correction protocols. You're not coming? In a minute. Ethan hesitated, then ran for the stairs. Alone in the cooling chamber, he rested one hand on the stabilized manifold. The vibration had softened, but he could still feel the tremor beneath the surface, like a pulse refusing to die. Footsteps echoed behind him. He turned. Silas Virelli stood in the doorway, no longer dressed like a desperate stranger. Tailored suit. Perfect posture. The same eyes. Recognition flickered between them. "You," Silas said quietly. He straightened. "Yeah," he replied. Steam drifted between them as the alarms faded into uneasy silence. Silas Virelli stepped fully into the cooling chamber, polished shoes stopping just short of the wet concrete. The transformation from desperate stranger to commanding executive was almost theatrical, except the memory of rain and trembling hands was still fresh in Caleb's mind. "You work here," Silas said, voice measured. "Yeah. You didn't hesitate last night, no." A faint nod. Not gratitude exactly. Recognition. Behind them, the mechanical hum steadied, lower now, controlled. Ethan's footsteps clanged up the stairs, leaving the two men alone in the industrial belly of the tower. Silas glanced at the disengaged actuator. "You bypassed proprietary automation. It was feeding itself bad data. Our consultants assured us the model self-corrects. It does," Caleb replied calmly. "Until it learns the wrong lesson." Silas studied him, really studied him for the first time. "Who trained you?" he asked. Caleb hesitated just long enough for the silence to mean something. "Logistics." "Where?" "Army." The answer hung in the humid air. Upstairs, the building lights stabilized fully. In the control room, investors exhaled in waves as red indicators faded to amber. Silas looked back at the manifold. "You understood the cascade before my engineering division did. I've seen worse. That wasn't in your personnel file. There's a lot not in there." A flicker of something crossed the CEO's expression, curiosity layered over pride. From the stairwell above, Marjorie's heels clicked sharply as she descended halfway, unwilling to dirty her shoes further. "Mr. Virelli," she called, tone carefully composed, "the situation is contained. Engineering is arriving shortly." "I can see that," he replied without turning. Her gaze slid toward Caleb. "We appreciate the initiative. But this breach of protocol will be reviewed." He didn't respond. He simply removed his gloves and inspected a faint burn mark across the knuckles. Silas noticed. "You were right about the pattern," the CEO said quietly. Marjorie stiffened. "Sir, you were," he repeated, eyes still on Caleb. For a moment, the only sound was the steady churn of coolant stabilizing the system. Ethan's voice crackled over the radio from upstairs, cluster A, B, and D holding steady at 4% over baseline. No further spread. Silas reached into his jacket and pulled out a handkerchief, offering it wordlessly. Caleb blinked, then accepted it to wipe sweat from his forehead. "I owe you thanks," Silas said. "You don't owe me anything." A faint, almost amused breath left the CEO. "Last night suggests otherwise." Marjorie's head snapped slightly. "Last night?" Silas didn't answer her. Instead, he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Why give it?" Caleb knew what he meant. "Because sometimes you just need breathing room," he repeated. Silas's gaze sharpened. Above them, word was spreading fast. Maintenance staff whispered in corridors. Junior analysts replayed footage of the manual override. Investors asked pointed questions about system resilience. Reputation, once ignored, was shifting. Marjorie cleared her throat. "We should move this discussion upstairs." Silas straightened. "Yes, we should." He looked back at Caleb. "Walk with me." It wasn't a request. They climbed the metal stairs together, steam thinning behind them. Each step carried the weight of unspoken acknowledgement. At the landing, Ethan waited, eyes wide. "They're calling it a near-miss miracle," he murmured. "No," Caleb said quietly. "It was predictable." The control room doors opened as they approached. Conversations died mid-sentence when the CEO entered beside the maintenance worker. Investors turned. Board members stood. Marjorie moved quickly to reclaim center position. "We've stabilized the anomaly. Engineering will conduct a full audit." Silas didn't take his seat. Instead, he looked at the main monitor, now calm, lines steady and green. Who logged the initial variance? He asked. Ethan swallowed. He did. All eyes shifted. Marjorie interjected smoothly. There was no actionable threat at that time. There was, Caleb said, not raising his voice. Cooling pressure fluctuation, minor spike. It was the start. You're suggesting executive oversight? She asked, edge returning. I'm suggesting you were looking at surface metrics. The room tightened again, but differently this time. Silas turned slowly toward Marjorie. Were we? She opened her mouth, then closed it. Silas faced the board. This company prides itself on predictive intelligence, yet a maintenance technician identified a cascade our consultants missed. He let the words sit. Poetic justice doesn't announce itself loudly. It settles in the quiet after disbelief. Silas glanced once more at Caleb. Schedule a full review of our infrastructure model. Yes, sir, Marjorie replied tightly. And include him. The room shifted again, this time undeniably. Marjorie's smile thinned. He's not cleared for strategic. He is now. A beat of stunned silence. If you're seeing what I'm seeing right now, subscribe with the bell on. Because the next move won't just shake this company, it'll change who leads it. Silas walked toward the executive elevator, pausing only long enough to say, my office. 5 minutes. The doors slid closed behind him. In the reflection of the steel, Caleb saw more than exhaustion in his own eyes. He saw recognition. And upstairs, on the glass wall outside the executive suite, one name still gleamed in bold silver letters. Silas Virelli. The silver letters gleamed under recessed lighting as the executive elevator doors slid open. Caleb stepped out beside him, boots quiet against the polished floor that rarely felt the weight of anyone outside tailored suits. Assistants paused mid-stride. Conversations hushed. Marjorie followed seconds later, composure restored, but eyes sharpened. The executive hallway stretched ahead, floor-to-ceiling glass on one side, the city skyline sprawling beyond it like a living balance sheet. Silas pushed open his office doors. Close them, he said. Caleb stepped inside. Ethan hovered uncertainly in the corridor until Silas added, Mr. Rowe, you too. The doors sealed with a soft hiss. The office smelled faintly of leather and expensive coffee. A sculpted metal globe rotated slowly near the window, symbol of global reach. On the far wall, framed patents and acquisition milestones marked a career built on dominance. Silas didn't sit. Instead, he removed his jacket and draped it over a chair, posture easing just slightly. You recognized me, he said. Yes. And you still gave me the money. Yes. Marjorie's gaze snapped between them. I'm sorry, what exactly is being referenced? Silas ignored her. Why? Caleb met his eyes evenly. Didn't matter who you were, it should have, Marjorie cut in. Context always matters. Not for that, Caleb replied. A beat of silence pressed against the glass walls. Silas walked toward the window, hands clasped behind his back. Last night I left a board dinner early. I wanted to see how this company feels from the outside. His voice was measured, but something deeper moved under it. No driver. No security detail. Just observation. And you were short $20? Marjorie asked carefully. Silas turned, expression cool. I was testing something. Caleb didn't react. And you passed, Silas said quietly. Marjorie stiffened. Sir, with respect, we are discussing a breach of operational protocol, not a street anecdote. We are discussing culture, Silas corrected. He stepped toward his desk and tapped the surface. The wall behind him lit up with system logs from the earlier cascade. Data scrolled in precise columns, timestamps, override commands, manual actuator disengagement. Walk me through it, Silas said. Caleb approached the display. The predictive model prioritized speed. It rerouted load automatically to maintain throughput during investor demonstration mode. Marjorie frowned. Demonstration mode enhances performance for tours. It masks vulnerability, he replied. Ethan swallowed. He's right. The system was overcompensating for optics. Silas's jaw tightened slightly. Continue. The coolant pressure fluctuation was the first sign, Caleb said. I logged it. When it spiked, the algorithm fed extra load to adjacent clusters instead of isolating the anomaly. That created the cascade. And your solution? Cut the feedback loop manually. Force the system to recalibrate around reality, not projections. Marjorie crossed her arms. That's not scalable strategy, it is in combat zones, he answered evenly. Silas's eyes sharpened. Logistics officer? Captain, how long? 8 years. Why leave? The question hung heavier than the rest. He hesitated, just enough to reveal it mattered. My daughter was born with asthma. Deployments weren't compatible with breathing treatments. The room shifted. Silas studied him again, this time not as maintenance staff, but as something else, something layered. You downgraded your career for family, he said quietly. I reprioritized. Marjorie stepped forward. This is admirable, but we can't ignore structural governance. If every employee overrides automation, he didn't override, Ethan interrupted before he could stop himself. He corrected it. Marjorie shot him a glare. Silas raised a hand, silencing her. Outside the glass, executives gathered discreetly, pretending not to watch. You said this wasn't random failure, Silas continued. Explain. Caleb tapped another section of the log. Demonstration mode increased load thresholds by 12% to impress investors. That's a vanity setting. It removes safety margins. Marjorie's face paled slightly. It was within acceptable range. Acceptable isn't resilient. Silas turned fully toward her now. Did you authorize demonstration mode? A pause too long. Yes. To optimize presentation, silence settled like dust after impact. Silas faced Caleb again. If you were designing this system from scratch, what would you change? He didn't hesitate. Build resilience first. Let performance be the byproduct, and you can implement that? Yes. No bravado. No pleading. Just certainty. Outside, someone whispered. He's considering it. Silas walked back to the window, city lights flickering as dusk approached. He rested one hand against the glass, staring down at the plaza where rain had washed the pavement clean hours earlier. You told me last night that sometimes people just need breathing room, he said without turning. Yes. Silas exhaled slowly. Perhaps this company does too. Marjorie's composure cracked by a fraction. Sir? He turned. Schedule a full executive assembly for tomorrow morning. For damage control? For clarity, his gaze shifted to Caleb. And clear that hallway. Marjorie blinked. Clear it? Yes. She followed his line of sight toward the polished corridor outside, where silver letters still reflected power in its most traditional form. Silas Virelli. He looked back at Caleb, something deliberate forming behind his eyes. By tomorrow, he said quietly, that door won't look the same. The weight of the words settled into the room. And for the first time since the alarms began, the power imbalance had begun to tilt. The executive hallway didn't clear quietly. Assistants whispered into headsets. Board members lingered near the glass walls, pretending to review messages while stealing glances toward the closed office doors. Word traveled faster than any automated system in the building. The maintenance captain had corrected the AI. Inside the office, tension thickened. Marjorie stood near the conference table now, tablet clutched in one hand like a shield. An executive assembly will raise questions, she said carefully. Investors are already unsettled. They should be. Silas replied. Ethan shifted his weight near the wall, still unsure whether he belonged in this room. Caleb remained standing, hands loosely clasped behind his back. He didn't scan the art on the walls or the skyline view. His focus stayed anchored, disciplined. Silas turned from the window. "We built this company on predictive dominance," he said. Yet today, a manual override prevented a public disaster. Marjorie's jaw tightened. "Because our fail-safes were temporarily adjusted for demonstration optimization, that's a generous description," Caleb said evenly. Her eyes flashed. "You're not part of this governance structure." "No," he agreed. "I'm part of the structure that keeps it from burning." The air snapped. Ethan inhaled sharply. Silas didn't reprimand him. Instead, he walked to his desk and tapped a control. The wall display shifted from system logs to internal communications, time-stamped messages sent earlier that morning. One message, marked urgent, glowed on the screen. Cooling variance noted. Recommend review before demonstration mode activation. It had been logged at 6:12 a.m. sent from maintenance, forwarded to operations. Marked non-critical. Silas looked at Marjorie. She held his gaze. At the time, the variance was within projected tolerance. "And now?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer. Ethan swallowed and stepped forward despite himself. He tried to escalate it verbally during the walkthrough. Marjorie shot him a warning glance. "You dismissed him," Ethan finished. Silence. Silas exhaled slowly. "This is not about embarrassment," he said. "It's about blind spots." Marjorie's voice sharpened. "With respect, elevating a maintenance technician in front of the board creates instability." "Instability," Caleb repeated softly, almost to himself. He finally shifted his stance, stepping closer to the display. "Instability happens when warnings are ignored," he said. "When systems are optimized for optics instead of resilience. When people assume rank equals accuracy." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Marjorie folded her arms. "Are you implying executive arrogance caused this?" "I'm stating executive insulation contributed to it." Ethan stared at him. No one spoke to her like that. Outside the glass walls, more executives gathered, sensing something larger unfolding. Silas studied Caleb's reflection in the display screen. Calm. Controlled. No tremor in his voice, no hunger for revenge. That mattered. "You're not angry," Silas observed. He considered that. Anger wastes time. "And humiliation?" He paused, just briefly. "Teaches you where the cracks are." Marjorie's composure thinned further. "If we're dissecting culture, let's be honest. He overstepped chain of command and saved the company," Ethan said before he could stop himself. Marjorie turned on him. "You're on probationary status, Mr. Rowe. Choose your alignments carefully." The threat hung in the air. Silas's expression cooled. "That's enough," he said. Marjorie stiffened. Silas stepped toward the door and opened it. The hallway fell silent instantly. Board members stood straighter. Assistants froze mid-step. He didn't raise his voice. Conference room. Now, executives filed in quickly, confusion and curiosity mixing in equal measure. Within minutes, the adjacent boardroom filled, polished table gleaming under recessed lights. Caleb remained near the doorway, uncertain whether he was meant to enter. Silas looked back at him. "You too." The boardroom doors closed. Silas stood at the head of the table, not sitting. "This morning," he began, "we experienced a near-critical systems cascade." Murmurs rippled. "Our predictive model failed to identify compounding stress under demonstration load." Marjorie remained composed, hands folded neatly. Silas continued. "The failure was corrected manually." He turned. "By the maintenance technician." Eyes shifted around the table, some skeptical, some impressed, some defensive. One board member leaned forward. "You're saying a facilities employee outperformed contracted engineers?" "I'm saying resilience does not respect hierarchy. A heavier silence settled. Silas activated the display again, replaying footage from the cooling chamber, the manual override, the pressure spike, the stabilization. Had this not occurred, he said, we would be discussing losses in the hundreds of millions. No one challenged that. Caleb felt dozens of eyes on him now. Heat crept up his neck, not from steam this time. This wasn't his battlefield. Yet somehow, it was. Marjorie cleared her throat. With proper procedural adherence, engineering would have arrived and, in 40 minutes, Ethan said quietly from his seat at the edge of the table. Silas let the silence stretch. Public exposure didn't roar. It accumulated. He turned toward Caleb. Explain demonstration mode. He did. Clear. Measured. Without accusation. As he spoke, board members began nodding, slowly at first, then with growing realization. Marjorie's posture remained rigid, but the room's gravity was shifting. When he finished, Silas faced the board again. Tomorrow morning, he said, we address structural reform. He paused. And accountability. The word landed heavier than any alarm earlier that day. Across the table, Marjorie's composure finally cracked by the smallest degree. The battle was no longer in the cooling chamber. It had moved into the open. The boardroom stayed silent long after the word accountability settled over the table. Outside the glass walls, dusk bled into the skyline, turning the city into a field of scattered lights. Inside, the atmosphere shifted from damage control to reckoning. Marjorie broke the quiet first. Structural reform requires committee evaluation, she said, tone precise. We can't pivot governance overnight because of one incident. Silas didn't look at her. This wasn't one incident. He tapped the screen again. A pattern of minor variance reports appeared, weeks of small warnings, each logged, each categorized as non-critical. Each signed off by operations. Caleb recognized his own timestamps scattered across the grid. Marjorie's voice tightened. Variance logs are common. Escalation thresholds exist for a reason. Escalation, he replied calmly, requires someone to listen. A few board members shifted in their seats. Silas folded his hands on the table. Demonstration mode was activated to impress investors. It was within policy, Marjorie insisted. Policy doesn't equal wisdom, he said quietly. The room absorbed that. Silas turned toward Caleb. If we removed demonstration mode entirely, what would it cost? Short-term optics, he answered. Long-term resilience, gains. And if we redesigned the system around your framework, it would slow presentation speeds by 7%. But it would eliminate cascade vulnerability under load spikes. Murmurs moved around the table. 7% wasn't catastrophic, not compared to a public meltdown. Marjorie leaned forward. He doesn't understand our growth projections. I understand failure, he said evenly. Silas's eyes sharpened. Ethan watched the exchange like someone witnessing gravity rewrite itself. The CEO rose from his chair. Tomorrow morning, he said, we will host a full company assembly in the atrium. Marjorie blinked. That's unnecessary. It's essential. For what purpose? For transparency. He walked to the glass wall overlooking the executive corridor. Employees were still gathered discreetly beyond it, pretending to work while glancing toward the boardroom. Silas turned back. Perception shifts when truth is visible. Marjorie stood as well. Publicly elevating maintenance staff destabilizes executive authority. No, Silas said quietly. Ignoring competence does. The words struck harder than he raised them. Caleb remained still, absorbing none of it with triumph, only calculation. Silas faced him directly now. I reviewed your file during the stabilization. He didn't react. Captain. Logistics Division. 2 commendations for infrastructure rescue under fire. Ethan's head snapped toward him. Marjorie's expression flickered. That information hadn't been widely circulated. Why take a maintenance role? Silas asked again, though he already knew part of the answer. My daughter needed stability, he said. Predictable hours. Insurance. The word insurance hung heavier than strategy. Silas nodded slowly. And yet you still study system architecture in your off hours, he didn't deny it. You annotated inefficiencies in internal reports most executives never read, Silas continued. Marjorie stiffened. Those annotations were informal observations. They were correct, Ethan whispered. Silas walked to the door and opened it. The hallway outside went silent instantly. Assistants froze. Analysts looked up from tablets. Clear the corridor, he said. No one argued this time. Within minutes, the executive hallway emptied, polished floors reflecting only recessed lighting, and one gleaming nameplate at the end. Silas stepped out into the corridor with Caleb beside him. Ethan lingered a few paces behind. Marjorie followed, heels sharp against marble. Silas stopped in front of the glass wall bearing his name. For a moment, he simply stared at it. Power had always looked like this, etched silver, elevated floor, private access. He turned to Caleb. You said resilience over optics, he murmured. Yes. Silas looked down the corridor again, then back at the board members gathering cautiously at the far end. Tomorrow morning, he said clearly, voice carrying, this company will introduce a new infrastructure resilience division. Whispers erupted. Marjorie's composure fractured visibly. You can't unilaterally restructure without vote. I can initiate it, and who exactly would lead such a division? Silence fell. Silas didn't hesitate. Him? The single word echoed more loudly than any alarm earlier that day. Board members exchanged stunned looks. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, hope sharp and electric. Marjorie's voice dropped lower, controlled but strained. He lacks executive clearance. Clearance is granted, Silas replied. A pause, then he reached up, fingers brushing the edge of the silver nameplate on the glass. By tomorrow, he said quietly, this door won't carry a single name. The hallway absorbed that promise. If you're watching this moment unfold, subscribe with the bell on because what happens at that assembly won't just change one man's career, it'll redefine power in this building. Caleb looked at the glass, then at the CEO. He didn't smile. He simply nodded once. The reversal was no longer theoretical. It was scheduled. Morning arrived with a different kind of tension, quieter, heavier. The atrium of Virali Dynamics filled slowly, employees gathering beneath the towering glass ceiling. Sunlight streamed through steel beams, casting long geometric shadows across polished floors. No champagne this time. No investor tour smiles. Just anticipation. Caleb stood near the back, maintenance jacket zipped, boots clean but worn. He hadn't slept much. Lena's inhaler sat on the kitchen counter at home, picked up late last night after an unexpected direct deposit notification had hit his account. He hadn't asked about it. He'd just paid the pharmacy and come home. Breathing room. Ethan found him near a support column. They're saying the entire board's here, he whispered. Press 2. He nodded once. Across the atrium, Marjorie stood with 2 board members, posture immaculate, expression unreadable. If she felt threatened, she hid it well. At precisely 9, the executive elevator doors opened. Silas stepped out alone. The room quieted instantly. He didn't take the raised stage immediately. Instead, he walked through the employees, past analysts, custodians, engineers, receptionists, until he stood in the center of them. That alone shifted the air. Then he stepped onto the platform. Yesterday, he began, voice steady but amplified through the atrium speakers, this company came within minutes of a catastrophic systems failure. A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Our predictive infrastructure did not predict. He let that settle. Instead, a manual override prevented a cascade that would have cost us more than money. Eyes began scanning the crowd. Some already knew. Silas continued. The warning signs were logged. They were dismissed. Marjorie's jaw tightened slightly, but she remained composed. We pride ourselves on innovation, he said. Yet innovation without resilience is vanity. The word hung sharp and undeniable. He stepped aside slightly. Yesterday, one employee identified the vulnerability before it escalated. He escalated it appropriately. He was ignored. Now the crowd shifted more obviously. Caleb felt the weight of eyes moving toward him even before his name was spoken. He then corrected the failure manually, Silas said. In real time. Under pressure, a pause. Captain Caleb Ardent. The name echoed through the atrium. Every head turned. Heat crawled up his neck again, but he didn't flinch. Silas extended a hand toward the stage. A few seconds passed. Then he stepped forward. Each bootstep echoed louder than it should have. When he reached the platform, Silas didn't stand above him. He stood beside him. This company failed to recognize competence because it arrived in a maintenance uniform, Silas said plainly. That will not happen again. Applause didn't erupt immediately. First came silence, processing. Then a few claps. Then more. The sound built gradually, like pressure stabilizing after a surge. Marjorie remained still, hands clasped. Silas raised his hand, and the applause softened. Effective immediately, he continued, Varelli Dynamics establishes the Infrastructure Resilience Division. Murmurs surged again. This division will audit, redesign, and safeguard every operational layer of this company. He turned toward Caleb. And it will be led by the man who proved resilience outranks hierarchy. The words landed with unmistakable finality. Shock rippled openly now. Board members exchanged stunned looks, but none interrupted. Marjorie stepped forward at last, voice smooth but strained. Structural leadership transitions typically require formal. Silas cut her off gently but firmly. Formalities have been addressed. A beat. Additionally, he added, demonstration mode is suspended indefinitely. Gasps flickered among analysts who understood what that meant for quarterly optics. Caleb finally spoke, voice steady through the microphone. Resilience isn't about slowing growth, he said. It's about making sure growth survives stress. He didn't speak long. He didn't need to. He outlined the redesign plan in concise terms, redundant safety margins, manual override redundancies, predictive recalibration based on real load patterns rather than investor projections. Clarity, not spectacle. As he spoke, something subtle shifted in the crowd. Maintenance staff straightened. Junior engineers nodded. Even senior analysts began taking notes. This wasn't charity. It was competence. Silas stepped forward again once he finished. One more thing, he said. The atrium quieted. Yesterday evening, I reviewed internal culture reports. Dismissal of expertise based on rank will no longer be tolerated. His gaze flicked briefly, deliberately toward Marjorie. She held her posture, but the message was unmistakable. Accountability, he said quietly, begins at the top. The crowd understood. Public exposure doesn't need shouting. It needs witnesses. And today, everyone was watching. Silas gestured toward the executive corridor visible above the atrium, where one polished glass door reflected sunlight sharply. After this assembly, he said, we make the change official. All eyes followed his line of sight. The silver letters still read, Silas Varelli. But not for long. The atrium remained suspended in charged silence as employees lifted their eyes toward the executive corridor above. Sunlight struck the silver letters on the glass, making them gleam almost defiantly. Silas stepped down from the platform. "Follow me," he said. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. A current moved through the crowd as people began ascending the curved staircase that led toward the executive level. Shoes clicked. Murmurs rippled. The board followed. Then department heads, then staff who had never before stepped beyond the invisible boundary separating labor from leadership. Caleb walked a pace behind Silas. Ethan trailed close, wide-eyed. Marjorie moved with controlled grace, though the set of her shoulders had shifted, less rigid, more guarded. When they reached the corridor, the glass walls reflected a procession no one would have believed 24 hours earlier. Silas stopped in front of his office door. The nameplate caught the light. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he turned to face the gathered employees. "Symbols matter," he said quietly. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a slim metal tool, something small but deliberate. Without ceremony, he slid it beneath the edge of the silver lettering. A faint scraping sound filled the corridor. The first letter loosened. Gasps fluttered softly behind them. Marjorie stepped forward instinctively. "Sir, this is unnecessary theatrics." Silas didn't look at her. "Yesterday," he said, still working the edge of the plate free, "a man gave his last $20 to someone he believed was in need." A murmur of confusion moved through the crowd. Silas straightened, holding the detached silver letters in his hand. "That someone," he continued, "was me." The corridor fell utterly silent. Caleb felt every pair of eyes shift again, this time with shock layered over respect. Silas placed the removed letters carefully on a nearby console table. "I left a board dinner early," he said. "I wanted to see how this company felt beyond glass and titles." His gaze met Caleb's briefly. He didn't know who I was. He didn't ask. Ethan's breath caught. He simply gave. Silas turned back to the crowd. "Last night I received generosity from the man we dismissed this morning." The words struck harder than any accusation. Marjorie's composure faltered, just slightly. Silas gestured toward the door. Power without perspective creates blind spots. He stepped aside. A facilities worker approached, summoned quietly earlier, with a new polished plate in hand. Not larger, not grander, just different. The hallway held its breath as the worker aligned the new plate beneath the empty glass. 2 names, side by side. Silas Virelli, Caleb Ardent. Not above, not below, equal. A ripple moved through the employees, something deeper than applause. Poetic justice doesn't humiliate. It corrects balance. Silas addressed the corridor once more. Effective immediately, infrastructure resilience operates as co-equal leadership within this company. Marjorie's voice cut in, controlled but strained. Shared executive authority requires board ratification. "It has it," Silas replied. A board member near the back nodded slowly. Marjorie went very still. Silas faced her directly now. "Operational oversight failed yesterday," he said calmly. "Your resignation will be reviewed by end of day." The words landed without raised volume, but their impact was seismic. A sharp intake of breath moved through the hallway. Marjorie held his gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, she lowered her eyes. Public exposure, accountability, not vengeance, consequence. Caleb felt the weight of the moment pressing against him. He hadn't sought this. He hadn't imagined it. He looked at the new nameplate. 2 names on one door. Lena's face flickered in his mind, her inhaler resting safely on the kitchen counter. Her small voice asking if he'd remembered. Breathing room, Silas extended his hand. This time, Caleb accepted it. The handshake wasn't for cameras, it wasn't exaggerated, it was firm, equal. Below them, employees began to clap, not wildly, but steadily. Maintenance staff, analysts, engineers, receptionists. The sound traveled down the corridor, through the atrium into the building's bones. Silas released his hand. "This isn't charity," he said quietly, only for Caleb to hear. "It's correction." He nodded once. Across the hallway, Ethan wiped at his eyes quickly, pretending he wasn't. Marjorie turned and walked away without another word, heels echoing more softly than before. Power had shifted, not through spectacle, through truth revealed in front of witnesses. Silas gestured toward the newly shared office. "Shall we?" Caleb looked once more at the glass. Yesterday he'd stood outside this building in the rain, handing away his last $20. Today, his name reflected back at him from the very door that once seemed unreachable. He exhaled slowly. Then he stepped forward beside the CEO and entered. The office felt different now. Same skyline stretching beyond the glass, same polished desk, same rotating metal globe catching morning light. But the air carried something altered. Less insulated, more grounded. Employees lingered in the corridor outside, reluctant to leave, as if stepping away might undo what they'd just witnessed. Inside, silence settled. Silas closed the door gently. For a moment, neither man spoke. Caleb walked toward the window and looked down at the plaza below. From this height, people looked small, movements reduced to patterns. It was easy to forget individual weight when distance flattened everything. "That's the problem," he murmured, almost to himself. Silas studied him. "Distance? Yeah." He turned back toward the room. From up here, systems look clean, controlled, predictable. They aren't? They're human. Silas allowed a faint smile. That may be the most inconvenient truth in corporate history. A knock interrupted them. "Come in," Silas called. The door opened. A senior board member stepped inside, expression composed but decisive. "We've concluded our interim review," she said. "Marjorie Klein has submitted her resignation effective immediately." The words didn't echo, they landed. Silas nodded once. Accepted, she turned to Caleb. "Captain, Director Ardent, the shift in title carried its own gravity. We expect a resilience proposal draft by end of week," she added. "You'll have it," he replied evenly. When the door closed again, silence returned. Silas moved behind the desk, but didn't sit. "Shared authority isn't symbolic," he said. "It requires friction." "I'm not here to replace friction," Caleb answered. "I'm here to redirect it." Silas considered that. Outside the office, employees began dispersing gradually, though whispers lingered in the corridor. Maintenance staff stood straighter now. Junior analysts exchanged glances that carried possibility. Ethan knocked lightly and stepped in. "Engineering just confirmed full system stabilization," he said, barely containing his energy. "Cluster resilience is holding under normal load." "Good," Caleb replied. Ethan hesitated. "People are talking about what?" Silas asked. "About how they were treated before." He glanced briefly toward the hallway. "About warnings that didn't go anywhere." Silas leaned against the desk, absorbing that. "Schedule listening sessions," Caleb said. "Every department. Not filtered through management." Ethan blinked. "You mean direct?" "Yes." Silas's eyes flickered with approval. "Do it." Ethan nodded and left. The office quieted again. Silas walked to the nameplate visible through the glass. 2 names. "Does it feel real?" he asked. Caleb looked at it thoughtfully. "It feels earned." Silas nodded once. A vibration buzzed in Caleb's pocket. He checked his phone. A message from Lena, Dad. "Nurse said my breathing's better today. Did you get the medicine?" He typed back quickly. "Got it, you're covered." A second message followed almost immediately. "You always fix things." He stared at the words a moment longer than necessary. Silas noticed. "Family?" he asked. "Yeah, you chose differently than most would. I chose what mattered." Silas exhaled slowly. "That's why you're here." The weight of that settled between them, not as flattery but as recognition. Outside, sunlight shifted across the skyline, glinting off distant buildings. From this height the city looked orderly. But he knew better. Systems failed in patterns. People did too. The difference was whether someone listened before collapse. A soft knock sounded again. This time it was facilities. "Sir," the worker said, "the new division signage is ready downstairs." Silas looked to Caleb. He gave a small nod. They stepped out into the corridor together. Employees paused as they passed, not stiff with fear, but steady with acknowledgement. Down in the atrium, a temporary display had been set near the base of the staircase. Infrastructure Resilience Division. Director, Caleb Ardent. No gold trim, no oversized lettering, just clarity. He stood before it for a long moment. Yesterday, he'd been escorted out of a control room for overstepping. Today, he was entrusted with safeguarding the entire structure. Poetic justice rarely announces itself loudly. It restores balance quietly. Silas extended a hand once more, not for ceremony, not for optics. For the work ahead, he said. Caleb shook it. For the work ahead, he echoed. Above them, the building systems hummed, steady, recalibrated. Not perfect, but listening. By late afternoon, the crowd had thinned, the atrium returning to its usual rhythm of footsteps and muted conversations. Yet something intangible lingered in the air, like a structure subtly reinforced from within. Caleb rode the elevator down alone this time. No executives, no board members, just the quiet descent through steel and glass. When the doors opened to the lobby, a few employees nodded as he passed. Not exaggerated, not performative. Simple acknowledgement. Respect, when real, didn't need volume. Outside, the city carried on, traffic weaving through intersections, wind pushing at street corners, sunlight softening toward evening. He walked to his truck, the same worn vehicle he'd driven for years. The seat creaked as he settled in, hands resting on the steering wheel for a long second before turning the ignition. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel it. Not triumph. Stability. At home, Lena was waiting at the small kitchen table, coloring something with intense concentration. When the door opened, she looked up instantly. Dad. He crouched as she ran into him, arms wrapping tight around his neck. "You got it?" she asked. He held up the pharmacy bag with a faint smile. "Got it." She grinned, relief bright in her eyes. "I told the nurse you'd fix it." He brushed a hand through her hair. "You've got a lot of faith." "You always fix things," she repeated. He stood and placed the inhaler carefully on the counter. The apartment wasn't large. Paint chipped slightly near the window. The couch sagged in the middle. But tonight, it felt anchored. He helped her with homework at the kitchen table, listening to her explain a science project about airflow and lungs. She spoke with animated hands, small fingers sketching invisible diagrams in the air. "Breathing's important," she declared seriously. "It is," he agreed. Later, after she'd taken her treatment and drifted to sleep, he stepped onto the narrow balcony outside their apartment. The city stretched out in a different way from here. Closer, louder, alive. His phone buzzed. A message from Ethan, system audit draft started. Teams fired up. Another from an unknown internal number, "Thank you for today." He stared at the skyline for a long moment. Yesterday he had stood in the rain outside a tower of glass, handing away his last $20 without expectation. Today, his name stood etched beside a CEO's. But the real shift wasn't on a door. It was in how people looked at one another inside that building. Silas had called it correction. He called it breathing room. Power didn't vanish overnight. Hierarchy didn't dissolve in a single speech. But cracks had been acknowledged. Warnings would be heard, and somewhere inside Virelli Dynamics, a system once optimized for optics was learning resilience. He checked on Lena one more time before heading to bed. Her breathing was steady, calm. Tomorrow would bring meetings, resistance, work that wouldn't make headlines. Rebuilding always did. But he wasn't intimidated by friction. He understood pressure, understood patterns, understood that sometimes the strongest structures were built by those who once worked unseen beneath them. If this story moved you, ask me for the next story title, and let's build another one together. Subscribe, and don't miss our next story. The CEO ignored the quiet single dad for months until her daughter whispered his name. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?